Imagine standing in a field in the dead of a Russian winter. The temperature is -30 degrees Celsius. Your boots are cardboard thin. Your rifle is jammed with ice. You haven't eaten in 4 days. And somewhere in the frozen darkness ahead of you, an entire Soviet army is moving, not retreating, not defending, advancing. Roaring forward with thousands of tanks, millions of men, and a fury that no human being on Earth had ever witnessed before. Now imagine you are the German officer who has to stop them. And you have no fuel, no ammunition resupply, no winter clothing for your men. And your Führer has just forbidden any retreat. This is not a story about a battle. This is a story about the moment the most powerful war machine in human history, the German Wehrmacht, began to die. Not from a single dramatic explosion, but from something far more terrifying, the slow, grinding, unstoppable collapse of the system that kept it alive. The supply lines, the fuel depots, the logistics network that stretched thousands of kilometers back to a homeland that was running out of everything. And on the other side of that frozen front line, a Soviet military that the entire world had written off as finished, shattered, broken, finished, was about to do something nobody saw coming. What you are about to hear will change the way you understand World War II forever. Let's go back to the summer of 1941. June 22nd. 4 in the morning. 3 million German soldiers, supported by nearly 4,000 tanks and 2,000 aircraft, crossed the Soviet border simultaneously in the largest military invasion in the history of human civilization. Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's masterstroke. The plan to destroy the Soviet Union in a single, overwhelming campaign before the first autumn rains turned Russian roads to mud. And for the first few months, it looked like it was going to work. The numbers were almost incomprehensible. In the opening weeks alone, the Germans captured more than 3 million Soviet prisoners. Entire Soviet army groups that contained hundreds of thousands of men, ceased to exist in days. The Red Air Force lost 4,000 aircraft in the first week. 4,000. Many of them never even got off the ground. Entire divisions were encircled, trapped, and destroyed before their commanders even understood what was happening. The world watched in stunned silence. Military observers from every nation on Earth concluded the same thing. The Soviet Union was finished. British intelligence estimated it would take Germany 3 weeks to destroy the Red Army. American assessments were similarly pessimistic. Stalin himself, by most accounts, suffered something close to a nervous breakdown in the first days of the invasion. He retreated to his dacha, refused to answer the phone, and reportedly told the men who came to find him that he expected to be arrested. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed like everything might actually fall apart. But something happened. Something quiet and hard to see at first, buried beneath the avalanche of German victories and Soviet disasters. Something that would eventually determine the outcome of the entire war. The Germans started running short of fuel. It sounds almost too simple to be the turning point of history. Fuel. Gasoline. Diesel. The unglamorous, invisible substance that makes modern armies move. But here is what you need to understand about the German war machine in 1941. It was extraordinarily hungry. A single panzer division, one division, consumed roughly 300 tons of fuel per day during active operations. The entire German army that invaded the Soviet Union needed thousands of tons of fuel every single day just to keep moving. And they were moving through a country that had almost no paved roads, where railroad gauges were a different width than the German standard, where bridges collapsed under the weight of heavy tanks, and where every kilometer of advance stretched the supply lines a little further, a little thinner, a little more fragile. The German military planners knew this. They had war-gamed it. They had calculated it. And their conclusion was brutally simple. They had to win fast. They had to destroy the Soviet Union before the supply system collapsed under its own weight. Which meant there was no plan for a long war. No contingency for a winter campaign. No winter uniforms stockpiled, because the whole premise of Operation Barbarossa was that there would be no winter campaign. The Soviet Union would be dead by October. It was the most catastrophic strategic gamble in military history. And the Soviets were about to call the bluff. Here is a fact that most people don't know about the summer and fall of 1941. While the Germans were winning spectacular victories, while they were encircling entire Soviet armies and capturing city after city, the Soviets were doing something extraordinary behind the scenes. Something that would take months to show its effects but would ultimately save them. They were moving their factories. Think about what that means for a moment. Not just packing up a few machines and loading them onto trucks. We are talking about entire industrial complexes, steel mills, tank factories, artillery plants, ammunition works, being physically dismantled, loaded onto thousands of railroad cars, and transported thousands of kilometers east, across the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German bombs and German armies, to cities in Siberia and Kazakhstan that nobody outside the Soviet Union had ever heard of. The scale of this operation is almost impossible to grasp. More than 1,500 major industrial enterprises were relocated eastward in the second half of 1941. Factories that had taken years to build were taken apart in weeks. Workers rode on top of the flat cars alongside the machinery, sleeping next to the equipment they would reassemble when they reached their destination. When they arrived at the new sites, in some cases in the middle of open Siberian plains in temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, they began working before the factory walls were even built. They worked under the open sky, in blizzards, in conditions that would have seemed incompatible with human survival, let alone industrial production. And they produced. By early 1942, many of these relocated factories were already running at significant output. By mid-1942, Soviet industrial production was exceeding pre-war levels in critical categories. And what was being produced in those frozen factories was not luxury goods or consumer products. It was weapons. T-34 tanks. Thousands of them. The T-34 was not just a good tank. It was arguably the best tank on the planet in 1941, and the Soviets were producing it in numbers the Germans couldn't match. Katyusha rocket launchers, which the German soldiers called Stalin's organs, a system that could saturate an area with rockets so rapidly it seemed like the sky itself was on fire. Artillery pieces in quantities that German logisticians couldn't comprehend. Ammunition, rifles, and aircraft, increasingly sophisticated aircraft that were closing the gap with German air power. All of this was building, accumulating, waiting, and the Germans had no idea. Now we need to talk about a man named Georgy Zhukov. If you want to understand why the Soviet counteroffensive was not just possible but inevitable, you need to understand Zhukov. Because Zhukov was one of the most remarkable military commanders of the 20th century, and he had been thinking about this moment since before the war even began. Zhukov was not a subtle man. He was blunt, aggressive, sometimes brutal, and completely, utterly relentless. He had studied mechanized warfare in depth during the interwar years, had commanded Soviet forces in the Battle of Kokon Gol against the Japanese in 1939, a battle that most Westerners have never heard of but which was a masterclass in combined arms warfare, and he understood instinctively something that most commanders on both sides were still struggling to grasp. Modern war, in the age of tanks and air power and mechanized infantry, was not decided by heroism or morale or the courage of individual soldiers. It was decided by logistics, timing, and mass. By the ability to concentrate overwhelming force at precisely the right place and precisely the right moment, then exploit the breach before the enemy could react. By the iron willingness to absorb punishment on one sector of the front in order to achieve decisive success on another. Zhukov had this understanding in his bones. And in the late autumn and early winter of 1941, with German forces standing at the gates of Moscow, with some German forward elements close enough to see the spires of the Kremlin through binoculars, Zhukov was given command of the defense of Moscow and the planning of what would follow. What followed was Operation Tayfun's collapse and then, almost immediately, Operation Counter. The German advance on Moscow had been a nightmare of logistics from the start. The Wehrmacht was exhausted. It had been fighting almost continuously for 5 months across terrain unlike anything its soldiers had trained for. The supply lines were stretched to breaking point. Fuel was being rationed. Ammunition reserves were critically low. The panzer divisions that had been so terrifyingly effective in the summer were down to fractions of their original tank strength, not just from combat losses but from mechanical breakdowns, from the grinding attrition of thousands of kilometers of operation over roads that destroyed vehicles even faster than Soviet fire. And now winter had come. The real Russian winter. The kind that Western Europeans had never experienced. Temperatures dropped to -20, -30, -40 degrees Celsius. German soldiers were wearing summer uniforms. Hitler had refused to authorize the distribution of winter equipment, partly because he didn't want to undermine morale by suggesting the war might last that long, and partly because the logistics system was already so overwhelmed that adding winter clothing to the supply pipeline would have made it collapse entirely. German soldiers wrapped their feet in paper. They stripped clothing from Soviet corpses. They suffered frostbite at epidemic rates. Engines wouldn't start without being heated for hours. Artillery pieces froze solid. Machine guns fired a handful of rounds and jammed. The most technologically advanced military on Earth was being undone by weather that the people defending against it had been living with for thousands of years. Meanwhile, Zhukov was preparing his counterattack. Here is what made it shocking. Here is the part that even seasoned historians find hard to fully explain. The Soviets counterattacked with divisions that had just been formed, with soldiers who had barely finished basic training, with equipment that had been rushed from the factories east of the Urals, with supply lines that were themselves stretched and strained. By any objective military calculus, this force should not have been capable of offensive action. But Zhukov understood something about the Germans that the Germans didn't understand about themselves. They were broken. Not on the surface. On the surface, German discipline and professionalism were still extraordinary. German soldiers fought with skill and determination even in the worst conditions. But underneath that surface, the Wehrmacht in December 1941 was an army that had been pushed past its sustainable limits. It was an army that had achieved everything its planning assumed was possible and then kept being asked to achieve more. And it had nothing left. The attack began in December 1941. Soviet divisions struck along an enormous front, targeting the exhausted flanks of German Army Group Center. And the Germans, who had no winter reserves, no fuel to reposition rapidly, no ammunition stockpiles to sustain defensive fire, began to bend. And then break. But here is where the story takes a turn that most documentaries skip over, and it's the most important turn of all. December 1941 was not the decisive counteroffensive. It was the beginning. It was the proof of concept, the first terrible demonstration that the German army could be made to retreat. But the truly decisive moment, the moment that set the trajectory of the entire war, came later. And it came because of a catastrophic German mistake that was part military overconfidence, part Hitler's personal pathology, and part a fundamental misunderstanding of the war they were fighting. In the spring and summer of 1942, Hitler made his decision for that year's offensive. Rather than renewing the drive on Moscow, he chose to strike southeast, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. The reasoning was simple. Germany was running out of oil. The Wehrmacht's insatiable fuel consumption was draining reserves that were already dangerously low. If Germany could capture the Caucasian oil fields, Baku, Maykop, the whole vast petroleum complex of the Soviet South, it could sustain the war indefinitely. And it could simultaneously strangle the Soviet economy by cutting off the fuel supplies that fed its own military machine. The operation was called Case Blue. And initially, it looked like 1941 all over again. German forces struck with terrifying speed and power, advancing hundreds of kilometers, capturing vast swaths of territory, encircling Soviet armies. The momentum seemed unstoppable. But Hitler, emboldened by success and increasingly unable to accept the constraints of military reality, made a decision that shocked even his most loyal generals. He split his forces. He directed one army group to push southeast toward the Caucasus oil fields. And simultaneously, he directed another force to capture a city on the Volga River. A city whose name had become a symbol. A city called Stalingrad. It wasn't strategically necessary to capture Stalingrad. The original plan had called merely for reaching the Volga and securing the flanks of the Caucasus Drive. But the city bore Stalin's name. And for Hitler, that made capturing it personal. It made it a matter of prestige, of ideology, of the titanic clash of his will against Stalin's. And so he poured resources into the urban assault, stripping the Caucasus Drive of strength, creating a situation where two separate operations were competing for the same limited supply pool and neither had enough to succeed decisively. It was into this moment, this stretched, overextended, logistically compromised situation, that the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. Let me tell you about the morning of November 19, 1942. The temperature is minus 18 degrees Celsius on the Don steppe. In the pre-dawn darkness, 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces open fire simultaneously along a 60-kilometer front. The ground shakes. The noise is indescribable. Soldiers who survived it said they couldn't hear anything for hours afterward. The sky above the German and Romanian positions defending Stalingrad's northern flank disappears behind fire and smoke and the shrieking of thousands of artillery shells. This is not a probe. This is not a spoiling attack. This is the opening movement of one of the most carefully planned and meticulously prepared military operations in history. Soviet planners had spent months preparing this moment. They had assembled more than 1 million men, nearly 1,000 tanks, and enormous artillery and air assets in conditions of extraordinary secrecy. Supply dumps had been built. Fuel and ammunition had been stockpiled in quantities the Germans would have found hard to believe. Bridges had been constructed. Roads had been prepared. Everything that the Germans had failed to do for their great offensives, the Soviets had done. The blow fell on the Romanian Third Army covering the German flank. These were not elite troops, they were Germany's allies, Romanian soldiers with inadequate anti-tank weapons, no mechanized reserves, and no way to stop what was coming at them. Within hours, the line disintegrated. Soviet tank columns poured through the gaps, fanning out into the open steppe behind German lines, moving south with a speed and purpose that German commanders watching it happen could barely process. The next day, a second attack struck from the south. And on November 23, the two attacking Soviet forces met at a town called Kalach on the Don. The encirclement was complete. 330,000 German and Axis soldiers, the entirety of the German Sixth Army, one of the most powerful field armies in the Wehrmacht, were now inside a pocket. Cut off. Surrounded. And the question that would determine whether any of them would survive was brutally simple. Could Germany supply an entire army from the air while simultaneously breaking through the Soviet encirclement ring? The answer was no. But it took months for the full weight of that answer to become undeniable. Hermann Göring promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could fly in 500 tons of supplies per day to maintain the Sixth Army in the pocket. It was either a catastrophic miscalculation or a deliberate lie. The maximum the Luftwaffe actually achieved was 150 tons on its best day, and the daily average was far less than that. The Sixth Army needed 500 tons daily to fight effectively. It was receiving a fraction of that. Men were placed on starvation rations. Fuel ran so low that heavy equipment had to be immobilized. Horses were eaten. Soldiers ate their boot leather. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, arguably Germany's most gifted operational commander, launched a relief attempt in December 1942. Operation Winter Storm. His panzer spearheads drove through Soviet lines with characteristic German skill and determination, closing to within 50 kilometers of the pocket before being halted by Soviet counterattacks and the sheer weight of their own supply problems. 50 kilometers. The men inside the Stalingrad pocket could hear the sound of Manstein's guns. They could see the flares in the distance. Relief was almost close enough to touch. But Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, refused to break out without Hitler's explicit authorization. And Hitler refused to give it, because any breakout would require abandoning the city, abandoning the symbol, and Hitler's pathological attachment to holding ground had by this point transcended military logic entirely. He told Paulus to hold. He told him relief was coming. He told him to trust in the strength of the German soldier and the certainty of German victory. He was lying. Or he was delusional. By this point it was hard to tell the difference. Manstein's relief force was pushed back. The pocket contracted. And on February 2, 1943, the last organized German resistance at Stalingrad ended. Nearly 90,000 German soldiers, the starved, frostbitten survivors of a 330,000-man army, shuffled into Soviet captivity. Of those 90,000, fewer than 6,000 would live to see Germany again. Stalingrad was the hinge. The moment everything turned. But it wasn't the end of German capability, and this is something you have to understand to grasp the full scope of what followed. The German army in 1943 was still extraordinarily dangerous. Manstein, in the aftermath of Stalingrad, performed a tactical masterpiece, the Third Battle of Kharkov, that stabilized the southern front and briefly gave Germany the initiative again. German soldiers, even after everything, continued to fight with a skill and ferocity that cost the Soviets enormous casualties. The Wehrmacht was wounded. It was not yet dying, which made the summer of 1943 the most critical strategic decision point of the war. Hitler chose to attack at Kursk. The Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. A German offensive that threw nearly 3,000 tanks and almost 500,000 men against a Soviet defensive system that was the most elaborate and deeply prepared defensive position ever constructed. The Soviets had spent months building defensive belts that stretched nearly 300 kilometers deep. They had planted more mines per kilometer than in any previous operation in history. They had positioned massive anti-tank reserves. They had prepositioned their counterattack forces with the patient, ruthless precision of a chess grandmaster who already knows how the game ends. And critically, this is the part that makes it so remarkable, the Soviets knew the attack was coming. They had intelligence that gave them the broad outlines of the German plan. They chose not to preempt with their own offensive. They chose to absorb the German attack, grind it to pieces in the defensive belts, exhaust the German armored reserves, and then counterattack into the ruins. It worked exactly as planned. The German assault at Kursk lasted barely a week before it was halted. The new Tiger and Panther tanks that Hitler had delayed the offensive to deploy proved far less decisive than promised. They broke down in large numbers, were channeled into killing grounds by Soviet defensive planning, and were available in insufficient quantities to change the fundamental equations of the battle. The German offensive was stopped cold. And then the Soviet steamroller began to move. Operation Kutuzov. Operation Polkovodets Rumiantsev. The names mean nothing to most Western viewers, but these were the counteroffensives that broke German Army Group Center and Army Group South simultaneously, driving German forces back hundreds of kilometers in weeks. City after city fell, Orel, Belgorod, Kharkov, retaken for the third and final time. The front line that had been pushed deep into Soviet territory began moving west, toward Germany, with a momentum that would not stop until it reached Berlin. Here is what made it unstoppable after Kursk. Here is the secret that the German High Command understood but couldn't find a solution to. The Soviets had fixed the supply problem. Not perfectly. Never perfectly. Soviet logistics remained improvised, sometimes chaotic, often brutal in their human cost. But they had solved it well enough. Well enough to sustain continuous offensive operations. Well enough to keep fuel flowing to tank columns that were advancing hundreds of kilometers through territory that had been fought over multiple times. Well enough to keep artillery ammunition stockpiles filled even when the guns were firing millions of rounds per month. Several ways, all working together. The Lend-Lease program from the United States and Britain had, by 1943, reached its full stride. Hundreds of thousands of American trucks were flowing into the Soviet Union through Iran and through the northern Arctic convoys. These trucks, ordinary, unglamorous, logistical workhorses, transformed Soviet operational mobility. Before Lend-Lease, Soviet supply units were dependent on horse-drawn transport and a railroad system that was perpetually overwhelmed. With American trucks, Soviet commanders could motorize their supply trains, could keep pace with advancing tank spearheads, could sustain offensive momentum in ways that had previously been impossible. American food was feeding a significant portion of the Red Army. American telephone wire was enabling Soviet commanders to coordinate across hundreds of kilometers of front. American aluminum was going into Soviet aircraft engines. This is not to diminish what the Soviet people and Soviet industry achieved. What they achieved was staggering, unprecedented in human history. But the Lend-Lease contribution was the difference between a military that could fight and a military that could win. Meanwhile, Soviet operational art, the theory and practice of large-scale military operations, had reached a level of sophistication that surpassed anything else being practiced anywhere in the world. Soviet commanders had learned from their disasters. They had adapted. They had developed and refined techniques for deep battle, for rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, for coordination of tank armies, artillery, air power, and infantry in combinations that the Germans found increasingly difficult to counter. And the Germans had run out of what they needed most of all, time. Let's talk about what 1944 looked like from inside the Wehrmacht. By 1944, the average German division on the Eastern Front was operating at somewhere between 50 and 70% of its authorized strength. Panzer divisions that should have had 200 tanks were fighting with 60. Infantry regiments that should have had 3,000 men were defending frontages designed for those 3,000 with 800. And replacements were coming. The German training system was still producing soldiers, but they were younger, less experienced, and being fed into a meat grinder that was consuming them almost as fast as they arrived. The fuel situation had become catastrophic. In 1943, American and British bombing had begun to systematically target the synthetic oil plants and oil refineries that were the lifeblood of the German war machine. By mid-1944, these attacks were having devastating effects. The Luftwaffe was training pilots who didn't have enough fuel to complete their training. They were being sent into combat half-trained, to fly against opponents who had full tanks and years of experience. German armored units were receiving fuel allocations that were fractions of what they needed for anything more than the most limited defensive maneuvers. And it was in this context of fuel starvation, replacement shortages, and strategic collapse that Operation Bag Ration struck. June 1944. The same month as D-Day in the West. June 23rd, just weeks after the Normandy landings. For Soviet army groups, more than 1.5 million men, 5,000 tanks, 5,000 aircraft, attacked simultaneously along a nearly 2,000-kilometer front in Belarus. The target was Army Group Center, the German force that had been at the heart of the Eastern Front since 1941. Army Group Center had 400,000 men. It was heavily fortified in the cities Hitler had designated as fortress positions: Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk. These fortresses were supposed to be anchors, strong points around which the German defense would pivot and hold. Instead, they became traps. Soviet forces bypassed the fortress cities, encircled them, and moved on. The garrisons were left to starve or surrender. The Soviet steamroller didn't stop to reduce each strongpoint. It left that to follow-on forces and drove westward with terrifying speed, following the gaps in the German line, exploiting every breakthrough before the Germans could seal it. The German command structure collapsed. Communications were cut. Divisions that tried to retreat found themselves surrounded before they'd moved 10 kilometers. Generals who asked for permission to withdraw received orders to hold that had no relationship to the reality on the ground. Hitler, 500 kilometers away in his Wolfschanz headquarters, was moving phantom armies on maps, issuing orders to units that had ceased to exist, firing generals who failed to achieve the impossible and replacing them with other generals who faced the same impossible situation. In 2 months, Army Group Center lost 38 divisions. Destroyed. Not mauled, not pushed back, destroyed. It was the greatest defeat in the history of the German army. Greater than Stalingrad by most measures. Greater than any defeat suffered by any German force in either World War. 300,000 German soldiers were killed or captured in the first 2 weeks alone. On July 17, 1944, 57,000 German prisoners of war were marched through the streets of Moscow, deliberately, publicly, humiliatingly, while Soviet fire trucks drove ahead of them hosing down the pavement, as if to clean away the contamination of the invaders' footsteps. The men who watched that parade, the Muscovites who had huddled in bomb shelters in October 1941, who had watched German forces close to within sight of the Kremlin, understood what they were seeing. This was not just a military victory. This was a reckoning. What explains the magnitude of this reversal? How does the most powerful invasion force in human history become a marching column of prisoners in less than 3 years? The answer lives in multiple places simultaneously, and you have to hold all of them in your mind at once to really understand it. The German plan for Barbarossa was a military plan built on an economic fantasy. Germany in 1941 did not have the industrial base, the raw material reserves, the fuel stocks, or the manpower pool to sustain a prolonged war against the Soviet Union. The plan required a short war because a short war was the only kind Germany could actually win. When the Soviet Union refused to collapse on schedule, when its armies kept fighting, when its government kept functioning, when its people absorbed catastrophic losses and kept going, Germany had no fallback position. There was no Plan B because the planners had convinced themselves Plan A was certain. Hitler's strategic decisions made the situation worse at every turn. The halt of the panzers before Dunkirk in 1940, which allowed 300,000 British and French soldiers to escape. The decision to attack Greece and Yugoslavia in the spring of 1941, which delayed Barbarossa by 5 critical weeks that some historians believe were the difference between reaching Moscow before the winter and not reaching it. The division of the summer 1942 offensive that created Stalingrad. The refusal to allow retreats that might have saved hundreds of thousands of men. The firing of generals who told him the truth and the promotion of those who told him what he wanted to hear. Each decision, taken individually, might have been recoverable. Taken together, they were fatal. And on the Soviet side, the picture is equally complex but runs in the opposite direction. The disaster of 1941 was real. Soviet losses in that first year were genuinely staggering, Genuinely catastrophic, unlike anything any modern military had suffered and survived. The fact that the Soviet state survived at all is extraordinary. Part of that survival was Stalin's willingness to delegate to military professionals, however reluctantly, once the scale of the disaster became undeniable. Part of it was the deep reserves of Russian society, the willingness of ordinary people to endure suffering on a scale that would have broken most nations. Part of it was geography, the vast distances that stretched German supply lines to breaking point while giving the Soviets room to retreat, to absorb losses, to reconstitute. And a very large part of it was the industrial miracle east of the Urals. Those factories, those workers, those engineers who dismantled entire industrial complexes and rebuilt them in the Siberian cold, they were as decisive as any battle. The guns and tanks they produced were the material foundation of everything that followed. Without them, the bravery of Soviet soldiers and the skill of Soviet commanders would have had nothing to work with. There is a human dimension to this story that numbers and operations cannot capture, and it would be wrong to end without touching it. More than 27 million Soviet citizens died in what they call the Great Patriotic War. 27 million. That number is so large it resists comprehension. The United States, in the same conflict, lost approximately 400,000 people, which was itself a tragedy that shaped American culture for generations. The Soviet losses were 60 times larger. In some Soviet villages, not a single adult male came home. There are regions of Russia and Ukraine and Belarus where the demographic consequences of those losses are still visible in the age structure of the population. The German military losses were also catastrophic. More than 4 million German soldiers died on the Eastern Front. Millions more were wounded, captured, permanently disabled. The families who waited for sons and husbands who never came home, the grief that settled over German towns and villages and never fully lifted, this was the human cost of the decision made in June 1941. There is a specific image that stays with me when I think about all of this. A German soldier named Hans, or Werner, or Klaus. I am making up the name because the story was true for tens of thousands of men with different names. He crossed the Soviet border in June 1941 with absolute confidence. He had been told this would be over in weeks. He was young, he was trained, he was part of the most powerful army on earth, and the fields of the Soviet Union stretched out ahead of him golden and endless in the summer sun. 3 years later, if he was still alive, which most of his comrades were not, he was retreating through the same fields. The roads he had advanced down were the roads he was retreating on. Except now they were full of his comrades' graves, and the sounds behind him were not the sounds of a collapsing Soviet army, but the sounds of Soviet artillery, Soviet tanks, Soviet aircraft, all the industrial might of a nation that had been counted out and had refused to accept the count. What did he think about, that soldier, as he retreated westward in the autumn of 1944? Did he understand how it had happened? Did he see the connection between Hitler's strategic decisions and the road he was now walking? Did he think about the fuel his tanks had run out of, the ammunition his artillery had run short of, the supply lines that had never been adequate for the war they were fighting? Or was he just cold and tired, and trying to survive one more day? Both things were probably true. The Battle of Berlin, in April and May of 1945, was the final chapter of this story, and it was written in the most devastating terms possible. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, nearly 7,000 tanks, 40,000 artillery pieces. The largest concentration of military power ever assembled for a single battle. Facing them were the shattered remnants of German Army Group Vistula, exhausted, under strength, running on almost nothing, commanded by men who knew it was over but were ordered to fight on anyway. The battle lasted 2 weeks. German defenders fought street by street, building by building, room by room. Boys from the Hitler Youth manned anti-tank weapons against Soviet armor. Old men from the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, which by 1945 was the last military reserve Germany had, died in the streets of their capital. It was a final, terrible demonstration of the gap between Hitler's fantasies and military reality. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself in a bunker 50 meters below the Reich Chancellery while Soviet shells impacted the street above. On May 2, the Berlin garrison surrendered. On May 8, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. It had lasted 5 years, 11 months, and 1 week from the German invasion of Poland to the final capitulation. It had killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people, depending on how you count the dead. It had redrawn the map of the world, destroyed two of the greatest empires in history, and created the geopolitical order that shapes the world we live in today. And at its heart, at the absolute center of why it ended the way it ended, was the story you have just heard. The story of a military machine that outran its supply lines, exhausted its reserves, and struck against a nation it did not understand with a plan it could not sustain. And the story of that nation's extraordinary refusal to die, its industrial rebirth east of the Urals, its military transformation from disaster to mastery, and its long, grinding, blood-soaked march from the gates of Moscow to the ruins of Berlin. This is history's lesson, written in the largest possible letters. Strategy without logistics is fantasy. Confidence without resources is catastrophe. And the willingness of ordinary people to endure extraordinary suffering in defense of their homes and their futures, that is a force that no army, however powerful, however skilled, however technologically advanced, has ever managed to simply bomb or blitz or panzer drive out of existence. The German army that crossed the Soviet border in June 1941 was the finest military instrument of the early 20th century. It was led by brilliant commanders, equipped with excellent weapons, and animated by a ferocious offensive spirit that had already conquered most of Europe. But it ran out of fuel, and the nation it was trying to destroy did not. That is why the war ended the way it did. That is why those 57,000 prisoners marched through Moscow. That is why the Soviet flag flew over the Reichstag. History doesn't always go to the most powerful. It doesn't always go to the most courageous. Sometimes, maybe most of the time, it goes to the side that can sustain itself longest. That can take the worst the enemy throws, absorb it, adapt, rebuild, and still be standing when the enemy has nothing left. The Soviet Union paid an almost unbearable price for that endurance. But it endured. If this story moved you, if it changed the way you see this conflict, if there is a single moment in this narration that made you stop and think, then you know what to do. Hit that like button, because it tells the algorithm that stories like this deserve to be heard. Subscribe to this channel, because there are dozens more stories just like this one waiting for you, stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary moments, stories of decisions that changed everything, stories that explain not just how the war was fought but why it unfolded the way it did. And I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me which moment in this story hit you hardest. Tell me what you knew before watching and what surprised you. Tell me which battle or operation you want to explore next. Your comments don't just help the channel, they shape what we make. Every comment, every view, every subscriber is a vote for more of this kind of storytelling. This is history the way it should be told. Not as a list of dates and names and numbers, but as a human story, brutal, complicated, heartbreaking, and ultimately about the most fundamental question any of us will ever face. What do you do when everything is against you? What do you do when you're out of resources, out of options, out of time? The answer, written in 27 million Soviet graves and 4 million German ones, is this: you find a way. Or you don't. And the way you find, or fail to find, determines everything. See you in the next one.